Greetings and welcome to Writers on Writing. I am your host, Dr. Brenda Greene from the Center for Black Literature. And this radio broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you every Sunday and gives you, our listeners, an opportunity to hear writers talk about their craft, their work, and their lives. And you can also watch a Zoom video of the writers on YouTube at the Center for Black Literature website, www.centerforblackLiterature.org. I am founder and executive director of the Center for Black Literature and director of the National Black Writers Conference and professor of English here at Medgar Evers College. I am so very pleased to have with me today Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. Welcome, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Greene.
Welcome. And we are very, very excited about your book, My Monticello. We're going to hear your thoughts about this book, talk about your craft as a writer and your influences as a writer. But first, I'd like to share with our audience some background information about you. You are the author, as I said, of My Monticello, which is a book of short stories and a novella. Your writing has appeared in Guernica, The Guardian, Phoebe, Prime Number, and elsewhere. Your short story, Control Negro, which I loved, was featured in Best American Short Stories in 2018 and guest edited by Roxane Gay, and was read by LeVar Burton as part of PRI's Selected Short Series. You've received fellowships from a number of organizations, which include Hedgebrook, Tin House, and VCCA. And you also are a veteran public school art teacher. And you are currently living and writing in Charlottesville, Virginia, where much of your writing takes place. So My Monticello, which is a book that has received a lot of praise, Roxane Gay wrote, "I was enthralled from the opening lines of this book. These chilling, thought-provoking, and expertly crafted stories showcase Johnson's range and ability. They broke my heart as well as my brain." I understand what she means by this. And Daniel Evans wrote, "My Monticello is a gorgeous, devastating collection of stories spotlighting the ways a life, a country, and a planet can tend toward disaster, but still be worth fighting for." And I think that what they really expose is how your short stories and your novella just focuses on so many themes and focuses on what we are addressing today. So I'd like you to begin by sharing with us, giving us some background behind the writing of some of the short stories and especially Monticello.
I'm sorry, you broke out just a little bit. You want to hear a little bit about how I came to write these stories?
How you came to write these stories. Yeah. And we'll focus a little bit more on Monticello, but maybe if you can begin with the other stories. As I said, you focus on so many things: race relations, immigration, white supremacy, police brutality, multiracial relationships, abuse. Absolutely. You touch on everything that affects the Black experience. And I just love your tone and your style. So why don't we start there with just giving our audience a sense of what these stories are about, what the genesis for them was.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I think for me, each of these stories is some sort of real experience, either an interaction with someone, or really just overhearing something, or being in the room when something happened, something that agitated me, or in many cases, an event that happened in the world, many events that happened in Charlottesville. So for example, the story Control Negro, which was anthologized in the Best American that you had read, Dr. Greene, that story was inspired by an event in 2015 when a University of Virginia Black honor student was bloodied by police. It was caught on tape. It was one of those moments that echoed moments that were happening all over the country, with interactions between Black people and police. And so, but this was right here in Charlottesville, very close to home. And it agitated me, and I was thinking about it. And the story was kind of a very inside out, very twisted response to what does it mean to be a parent of a Black son? How does one keep one's child safe? What is the psychological harm of brutality for people over time, and how can that, and how difficult it is to contend with. And so it's that kind of story. And then for the other stories, again, a lot of different, experiences in schools. I was a public school teacher for 20 years in Virginia. So interactions there, you'll see a lot of that. And being a woman, being a Black woman, experiences, just in the world. And then the novella, for which the whole collection is named My Monticello, is the story. I live in Charlottesville. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello is right up the hill from us. And I kind of took my neighborhood, the Ridge Street neighborhood in Charlottesville, and First Street is right around the corner from me, and kind of pushed time forward a little from in August in 2017, we had the Unite the Right rally here, which many people may remember, which was one of the early experiences of white nationalists coming very violently here and parading, marching, and ultimately a young counter protester, Heather Heyer, was killed. But it was just a very traumatizing event. So that story was kind of my imagining of what might happen if this energy and this force is not only, obviously it's part of a long tradition, but what if it's enabled along with just a time of not focusing on infrastructure, having things kind of fall apart even more, and what might happen to a group of neighbors who are ousted out of their house by white supremacists, and in this case, led by a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and they go up and they end up taking refuge in Monticello, in Thomas Jefferson's plantation home.
Yeah, as I was reading the story, I couldn't get out of my mind Parable of the Sower, with Lauren taking the group of people, multiracial, from all different backgrounds, and the violence, the environmental disaster, the violence, it just kept coming up in my mind. So am I correct?
So I really, I love Octavia Butler. I had not read Parable of the Sower when I wrote that. I had read Kindred and a lot of her other work. So I actually read it. I read it afterwards. And I totally see the relationship. But I think that she wrote an essay, in essence, I think way back in the 70s, about rules for predicting the future. So Octavia Butler's like kind of, the original, the OG Black futurist, really thinking about, and using speculative fiction and science fiction to think about all kinds of things, but definitely race and gender and culture and how we interact in the world, and using these kind of ideas to push how we see things and recognize things. But she really talks about how in Parable of the Sower in particular, it's an act of hope, because you're offering warning, you're looking at things as they are, and you're projecting them into the future in a way to say, let's look at this and pay attention, because this is the natural outcome of this. And so I think I had that in mind too. I had that same instinct.
Well, you had that visionary spirit, and you also focused on the importance of community and the importance of having some guidelines and working together. And we can fight this, we can combat this if we are together. And also the importance of diversity. You have so many diverse people, and then those interpersonal relationships that people developed with the other. That comes really across in your book. What does it feel like to be a Black person in conversation, in a relationship with the other? Whether that be, from a race perspective or ethnic perspective, you bring all of that in.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that came through. That was really important to me. As we said several times, I was a public school teacher for a really long time, and I believe in the project of public spaces where everyone can have access and be safe, even though it's a very imperfect project. But as an art teacher, I had the experience of being in Charlottesville with an extremely diverse group of kids and trying to make community there and trying to create a space where every single kid could have access to the experience of making art, something meaningful to them, and feel safe and feel validated and feel reflected. And so I used a lot of those ideas, particularly in the novella. I made my heroine, Denasia Love. She's studying at the University of Virginia to be a teacher. And so she really uses some of the tools that teachers would use. She finds herself in this really difficult situation of being at Monticello with a diverse group of neighbors, some of whom she knows. Her grandmother is there, her boyfriend is there, but a lot of people that she knows just tangentially. And she has to help them, or she feels called to help them create some sense of community. So she uses kind of some of the things teachers do on the first week of school. You know, they write this kind of document together. And so anyone who's been in a classroom at the beginning of the year knows teachers sit down and, you know, you get input from people and you kind of say, we're going to do this, we're going to do this together. And since they're up at Monticello, they call it a hasty constitution. They call it like, you know, they call on this idea of history, like, so it's kind of hearkening to this American experiment, right? So we're going to agree on these things. Can we actually make them work? Can we make it so that everyone has access? Can we make it so that everyone feels safe?
Right. I thought about also the king of Exandria. Exandria was very interesting, and you brought out how we deal with differently abled youth, and also the immigrant experience. You know, I thought that was very, very interesting too, because I don't think we don't normally get that perspective, particularly on how the African child may be created and the perception of him in that space. You want to just share with our audience briefly what that story was about?
Sure. So the King of Xandria is the story of an immigrant who comes, Mr. Atta, who migrates from Nigeria. He comes on a visa legally, but then overstays his visa. He comes kind of filled with grief. He's not a poor person in his country. He has some power, but he kind of uses all his power to come to the United States to kind of escape his grief. And so he's there and he's navigating his children's lives and their introduction to this new culture and his like lack of power in it, including his son is kind of, you know, going into the special ed realm, and he's trying to deal with that as well.
Yes, that was very moving. And of course, as I said, the control Negro. So when you think about the message that you have for your audience, what messages, what do you want them to come away with from this book, these short stories?
Yeah, I think you can't, I think about this all the time. This is my first book going out in the world, and now I have a lot more respect for every single writer who's ever lived, because it's a very vulnerable thing to write something. It can be very personal and to put it in the world, and you don't have control over what someone comes away with. But that's kind of good too. Maybe they'll come up with something even grander than you imagined. What I would hope people come away with is, I don't know, I think of it as like decentering the insider and centering the outsider, and maybe making people who feel, for whatever reason, maybe from one story to another, it may be different whether they feel inside or outside the story, but making them have, hopefully, I know people say it all the time, but empathy, and be in the space of that person and have some empathy for them. And for the outsider, I want maybe that validation, that feeling of recognition. I know what that feels like. And for everyone, just a series of questions. You know, I thought a lot about, how do we deal with extremism, whether we're inside or outside of it? How do we take care of this? You know, how do we access home, and how do we take care of our home in an environmental sense? How do we respect one another and create community within people we, you know, feel like we're like, and and when we feel different, how do we create that? I think those are really important questions, and I hope people, are called to think about them in a different way, maybe even just for a moment, or someone is.
Yes, I like the way you talked about the insider, having the insider, the outsider perspective. And I think part of what helps you to achieve that very laudable goal is your tone and the language you use. I think it was really a really good way of engaging the reader by using the second person, for example, in The Control Negro, because, and I thought about Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place. I don't know if you've read that, but she uses the second person to reflect on Antigua and what that was like. That's one of my favorite books. It's beautiful. And it ends up, the tone is almost also sort of, it's lilting and poetic, and it really, as I said, it's personal. So I think as a reader, I'm immediately drawn to that. And even when you talk about the buying a house ahead of the apocalypse, when you make that list of things that people don't normally think about as a Black person, when you're buying a house, what does it mean for a Black woman to try and buy her house for herself? So I think the craft. So talk a little bit about the craft. What is your writing process, and who are the people you're looking at when you are writing?
That's such a hard question. So I have been writing a really long time, but I didn't get an MFA. I didn't go to school for writing. I really tried to just read and create my own ear towards what I liked, but then also just practice, just doing it, and through that evolving kind of what voice I wanted to create. I think I'm really interested in compressing things. I really love short stories. I love when there's space in something, around something. So really just a lot of practice, and also workshop and getting feedback from people is really helpful. I think when you're trying to make something, you want to hear how someone else takes it. And it doesn't mean you have to chase their approval or you have to do everything someone else says, but it just gives you a sense of what it is. And then you have to go back to your own, you have to go back to yourself and decide, well, is that what I want it to be? Or is that landing the way I want it to? And where, how much, I don't know, the lever, you kind of push it back and forth to where you want it to be. So there's a lot of that for me, doing that.
And then who are the people who you are reading, or who may be who've influenced you as a writer?
Oh my gosh. So I read all over the place. When I was, one of my formative first loves, like many people, is definitely Toni Morrison. Yes. Just when I was, 17 or 18, I read Beloved, and I was blown away by just, first of all, I think I watched a clip of her in my library talking about some of the obscenities of slavery that she was kind of using as the motivation, but then creating this thing that was both terrifying and absolutely gorgeous at the same time. I think that really stuck in my mind, and to take something obscene and make art from it and just create people that feel very real and whole, and a diversity of people, and not people who are trying to play a morality, but they're just humans that are navigating the world, a whole community of people. I really loved her. I read people like Richard Wright. I actually just reread Black Boy, but I remember when I read it as a young person, she has these like vignettes of poetry in the work, and he says it was the summer sun or whatever, and it's just, I just love that piece was in there when someone's telling this kind of story of both their own personal agency, but then also the pressures of the world, and kind of playing between those two things. I think as a young person, I definitely appreciated that. And I love storytellers. I'm going to get to talk to Danielle Evans later this week. And she was my dad gave me a clip of her in the Washington Post when she first came out, and I got to interview her here in Charlottesville for her first collection, which is absolutely gorgeous stories. I really related because we both grew up in kind of Northern Virginia area to writers like her. In college, I loved Nikki Giovanni. She was my friend's poetry teacher in Blacksburg. I was in James Madison across the
She's in
way
your
and reading,
book too. I
reading
think
people
she's
like that.
mentioned in your book, right?
Yeah, and yeah, but yeah, those are just a few.
Okay. Yeah. So the influencers in your book obviously had a major impact. So what would you say when you are reading them, these people who you're reading and who influence you, are you actually studying their style and their craft? Because, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the craft. And as an artist, there's probably some overlap in how you approach art and how you approach writing. Can you talk a little bit about that? And I wanted to follow up too with the reason that you chose speculative fiction.
So yeah, I'll start with when I'm reading, am I looking for, I don't think for me it's that conscious. It's not like I look at something and say, I want to take elements of this and use it in my work. For me, it's more like the things I like and the things I'm drawn to and the things I read kind of become part of my way of creating, or maybe I'm drawn to things that reflect the way that I want to create. I don't know which it is. And so for me, the craft is just the conscious idea of once I get a story down, often I'll write something in a pretty condensed amount of time, at least a draft of it. And I'll even start with this. Usually something is agitating me. It's bothering me. I'll start to hear a little bit of it. I'll start to kind of gather energy around it. And then by the time I'm writing, I've been thinking a little bit about it and it'll kind of come out as a whole thing. And then the craft to me is in the editing and making sure that the scenes that feel really complete are supported by things later that is believable. So for example, in the story, in the novella, this group of people have to go up to Monticello. I had that just really came to me, that idea. But then I had to have them like be in Monticello and feel realistic. And how would they physically survive? And how could I use this space? So going back and really thinking very logically about how could this work? What season would it be? What would they have around them? And really try, and also just emotionally, what would make a group of people stay here and not go somewhere else? What are the pressures I can exert on them to make this story feel the way I want it to, which is contained in this space, to have them feel both protected, but also really vulnerable in their containedness. Just the things I knew what I wanted. And then it's a matter of like, how do you create this? So I don't really look specifically to one thing and say, I want to bring that element in. I don't think, oh, I want to write in second person. I hear that voice and then I just try to use my ear from the things I've loved. I will say another artist that's more contemporary that I really loved and I started reading early on writing this collection is Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. I don't know,
Yes.
Friday Black, his collection. I read his story, Friday Black, on Black Friday. That was the first story I read. The initial story in that collection is incredible and just one of those stories you read and you really remember. But the whole collection, he just talks about grief, consumerism, race, in such interesting ways, and really uses a lot of genre, almost horror tropes within this very literary space and puts them side by side in this way I really admire. I think we talked about Octavia Butler, and I do like that. I like the accessibility of some of the genre things, but I like the like fully realized characters and the complications of literary things. So I think those are really nice matches.
Do you think that that there's been a rise in speculative fiction by Black writers? Do you think that's going to continue? What are your thoughts on speculative fiction and literature and the future of Black literature now, or the state of Black literature, I should say?
Oh my gosh, there are people way smarter than me that could talk on that.
Well, but as your, this is your debut debut novel, and I'm looking at you, I'm looking at Daniel Evans, I'm seeing a shift in the kinds of themes that Black writers are writing. They're complex, but you see more themes around interracial, you see more interracial themes, you see more examples of the colorism, you see the historical alternative histories. And
Yeah,
there's a new wave happening.
I definitely think that the world has, well, first of all, there's the weight of history, right? There's so much gorgeous literature. There's so much gorgeous Black literature that's been there. And so people are always looking for a place to create something not necessarily new, because we're all recycling and reusing and looking back at things, but finding a new way to combine things to make something unique and make something interesting. And also, I will say for me, I didn't think about the fact that this was speculative fiction. I do think the first story and the last story have that element for sure. They're just pushed beyond like true realism. Even Buying a House Ahead of the Apocalypse, there's this way, this character, this mom who's writing this list, a single mom about her house, is imagining apocalypse, and you don't know how much of that is literal. It feels kind of, in her head in a way, but also true. I think it was just the only way to get at what I wanted to say, because it had to be exaggerated in a way in order for it to feel as real as it feels in real life. So it's like lying a little bit to get at the truth. Putting people
what
up
writers do, right?
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
I'm pushing it to the point where you're like, oh, that's how it actually feels. Because when something's happening to you, you have the feels, you feel it. And so there's a way, just I think in movies and TV and in literature, a lot of people are using these exaggerated spaces or these speculative spaces to get at the horror of racism, or the difficulty of navigating the world within gender, or the complication of dealing in these spaces where you're with people who are similar and different. Just getting at those things through those spaces, I think has been, it's just one tool to get at it, for me at least.
Well, as we come to a close, I understand that there's a good possibility that Monticello will be a film. So congratulations on that. That's
Thank
really
you.
exciting. Imagine they're going to take the novella. Is the focus on the novella?
Absolutely. So they are, so Netflix there's a screenplay, and they're adapting just the novella into a film. And I'm really excited about it. Did not think that was going to happen. It's really exciting.
Well, it says something. You're a visionary. You spoke to the times. There's a need for imagining the life of Sally Hemings and looking at Jefferson from another perspective. So I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me. And I want to remind our listening audiences to go out and to purchase My Monticello by Jocelyn Nicole Johnson. It is a phenomenal book, and it really gets you thinking, and very accessible, really engages you. And I want to congratulate you for this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greene. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Remember, the writer is always reading, the reader is always writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers, and write me at MEC, writers@mec.cuny.edu. This radio broadcast is paid for by Medgar Evers College of the City University of New York. Thank you, and bye.